Thank you for joining us for today's Ipsos webinar featuring insights from the Ipsos Alcohol Consumption Tracker. Okay, so now without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Asad Amin, Senior Vice President and Head of Syndicated Solutions. Asad, you have the floor.
Thanks so much, Ellen. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are. Thanks for joining us today. I'm very, very excited to share with you our latest findings as it relates to alcohol consumption behavior and the trends related to it as well. The topic of alcohol and alcohol consumption has been facing a lot of headwinds as of recent. Abstinence seems to be, the word du jour for the category. Sober curious, low/no alcohol, dry January. These are terms that weren't really part of our lexicon until very recently, and you can see the media coverage and publication related to it has been pretty seismic, especially in recent days. But what we want to understand is how valid are these? There's a potential alarmist point of view for the sector, but what reality is grounded in this based on actual consumption behavior? So what we want to do today is look back over the past decade. And the reason it's the past decade is we have a decade's worth of rich quality information when it comes to alcohol consumption behavior. And that in itself will help us understand whether a lot of these factoids are valid or not. And our preliminary take is that there are some elements, but the actual consumption behavior that we observe actually paints a slightly different picture to that. So I'm going to throw a couple of numbers in front of you. First one, 52% of monthly incidents for beverage alcohol basically reflects about half of all Americans drink a type of alcohol over the course of the last month. Now that hasn't changed over the last 10 years. Since 2013, that's been pretty much the same. Similarly, if we look at the number of alcohol beverages or servings an average American has over the course of the month, it's around 26. And again, that also has not changed over the course of the last decade. Now, what we do start seeing some shifts are around frequency. And what this is the number of occasions a drinker has over a course of the last month. And that's actually dropped by 9% versus 2013 if we look at 2022. So that's a pretty big difference in terms of how many occasions exist for beverage alcohol over the course of the month. But what's been kind of going up and balancing it off is the intensity. So the number of servings an average drinker has per occasion, so pretty much how much they drink within that occasion, has been going up, and that's up by 10%. Now we'll break down exactly what some of the factors behind a lot of this is, but the main thing to keep in mind is that yes, there are changes afoot, but it might not be as dire as one may perceive, but I think we need to break into exactly what that is over time as well. Now, the information I'll be sharing with you to really help you understand what's going on behind the scenes when it comes to alcohol consumption is kind of inspired by our Global Trends report. And this is a massive report that's across 50 different countries that looks at more than a dozen different trends. And what we've done is we've distilled into 5 key trends that really affect beverage alcohol. And we're going to look at our data that looks at the actual behavior change over time and exactly what the impact has had on a more granular level for each of them. So the 5 trends that we'll talk about, first of all, is intentional socializing. I think the changes that we've seen through the pandemic, consumers, and especially when it comes to alcohol occasions, are a lot more mindful when they're socializing and just behavior in general. And I think that's had an impact on when and where and how and why consumers are drinking. One of the biggest factors that are affecting not just alcohol, but pretty much all categories and industries out there is this shifting generational change that we're having. The passing of the baton between older generations to younger cohorts is pretty much one of the biggest factors that's rounding out a lot of the changes we'll see today and throughout for beverage alcohol as well. Consumers' knowledge is much higher than ever before, and that is informing a lot of the decisions they make. And this does not limit their behavior when it comes to beverage alcohol consumption. And that is one of the biggest disruptions we're seeing in the category currently as well. I think consumers generally are keeping more accountable on corporations' behavior when it comes to how authentic and traceable their ingredients are. So a lot of the craft movement in beverage alcohol started from there, but that's gone beyond. So when we're talking about the topic of environment, social, and governance, it's like, what are you doing? What are the actions you're taking that resonate well as well? And finally, transforming of ingredients. There is a lot more consumers want when they're drinking alcohol, and there's different needs that require beyond just satiation or the pleasure of drinking. And what are we doing to try and address this? I think the main point is there's lots more layers beyond this, but these are all interchangeable. They kind of affect each other. And we're trying to ensure that we understand what's going on behind the scenes for each when it comes to alcohol. I'm sure you've seen a lot of trend reports, and in terms of changes that you see, ours is based on hard facts, and the primary source of our information is the ACT study, or ACT. This stands for the Alcohol Consumption Tracker that's been around for a decade. It looks at consumption behavior over the course of an entire month, and the rich data set allows us to not just look at the 5 Ws, that's kind of table stakes, but really it helps understand the whys behind a lot of behavior changes as well. And of course, within our arsenal, we look at a lot of other categories, and we've been looking at consumption behavior over the last decade. That allows us to tie in a lot of the changes we see on total consumption across all categories within food service as well. And of course, the arsenal we have at our disposal at Ipsos really helps tie a lot of things together as well. So let's dig into what these drivers of change are within the alcohol sector, starting with the first point around intentional socializing. Now, we've gone through this once in 100-year event, which is the pandemic, and it's hard to believe that it's behind us. But we are still adjusting, and we're trying to return to normal, whatever that is. And I think we're still trying to latch on to some of the values and habits we've developed over the course of the last 3 years. One of the points that we've heard from our global consumers is that they think the world is changing too fast, so a whopping 83%. I think consumers really are looking at simplifying their lives. And as they return to normal, how can they still latch on to some of the things that they've enjoyed, I think, over the course of the last 3 years? And there has been some. 61% of global consumers increasingly feel the need to spend time alone. So I think the rapid pace of our lives in terms of complete packed agendas, frantic schedules, as we get to normal, whatever that is, we want to do that gradually. And I think the impending factor of inflation also limits our ability to go pretty much all out initially as well. So let's have a look at exactly how this is impacting alcohol consumption as well. So starting with generally, what is the top concerns among Americans? And by far and wide, rising prices and inflation, as you can see, is by a mile the biggest concern among everyone. I mean, this has been around for a while. Of course, it peaked and it kind of stabilized, but you can see it's still growing as a concern. Consumers are still impacted. And obviously, they are going to change their behavior, including when it comes to beverage alcohol consumption, if it's top of mind. You know, in contrast, if you look down around COVID-19 pandemic, that's gone down the most, around 11%. So it's a pretty big shift as we are going away from one major concern over another one, which is potentially putting consumers by the sidelines in terms of how they want to change. Now, if we actually look at the shift around the servings of alcohol, we certainly see an improvement versus last year or around 2021. So, you know, there is an improvement, even though we saw a large shift right at the start of the pandemic. Even versus 2021, we're seeing higher levels of servings. But if we go back to pre-pandemic at around 2019, it's still slightly softer than before. And if we break this down by both control and open states, you can see control states are flat and then also not have returned to pre-pandemic serving levels. Open states, however, are the ones that are driving a lot of the gains, even though they are still below pre-pandemic times. So I think the main takeaway here is that there's a level of demand out there, and if it's available and accessible, there would be potentially strong levels of growth for alcohol. But we're not out of the woods yet in terms of returning to where we expect to be. Now, before I get into some of the reasons behind it, it's important to see, well, what's happening between the different types of venues where alcohol is served. And again, we're going to look at pre-pandemic around that pandemic time, maybe around the second phase, and what we've coined as the pandemflation era, where you've got a mixture of coming out of the pandemic, and then there's still the dealing of inflation as well. So when we look at the ratio of off-premise consumption for alcohol, it's not returned to where we expected prior to the pandemic. It certainly was much higher around 2021 because we weren't going to restaurants as much and dining out. But you can see the off-premise consumption, which accounted for a quarter of all servings for alcohol, is now about a fifth. And that's certainly having an impact on alcohol returning to where you were expecting it to be in terms of servings. Now, that doesn't mean that restaurants aren't returning to normal. They are. But what we understand is consumers are pulling back in terms of what they order, and beverages are the ones that are taking the highest hit. They still want the small indulgences and the luxury of going out, and they've been suffering for 3 years. But they're not limiting their dining out behavior, but they are limiting what they're ordering. So this is something to be mindful of, especially again in the climate that we're in terms of how does this impact long term as well. Now, before we break down of opportunities we can look at on-premise, I think it's important to understand the category shifts and what kind of play or strategic play you can have for categories. So starting with beer, the bigger you are, the harder you fall. This kind of exemplifies it more than anything else. It's by far the biggest category, but it is really being impacted a lot, especially with growth in other categories in beverage alcohol. It's by far lost the most share, and it's got equal footing in both on and off premise as well. Spirits, second largest, however, is more developed on premise and actually growing in share because the appeal for it has been growing in general over the years. So it's not in a bad position overall. Now, RTDs, really hot topical, and that's ready to drink beverage alcohol. This is where your hard seltzers fall and other types of canned products. They've been growing the fastest. All the measures we look at, whether it's servings, frequency, intensity, all have been growing, but it's still a small category. And we are seeing some level of saturation and peak in recent periods, but the opportunity exists even in on-premise. It's primarily focused off-premise. Retail channels are where it's grown the most. There could still be an opportunity and play for it within the on-premise environment. And then wine is another category. It's just behind spirits in size. It's also been affected to some large degree, even though a lot of its focus is where most people are drinking, which is off-premise. But I think it's that share of stomach and what you're vying for in your competitive set is what's challenging that. Now, returning into on-premise, and this is again food service and restaurants, what's the strategy and play you can have here? We know that people are returning back to restaurants. How can you take advantage of that? And don't forget the lucrative opportunity and the commercial viability of having higher margins and price points within food service is tremendous. So what we did was we looked at very frequent consumers of alcohol on premise, and we defined them as drinking more than once a month to having more than 9+ servings per month. Now, they're not that big. They're only about a third of total beverage alcohol drinkers when it comes to on premise. However, what they do is they drive the most amount of servings. In fact, 3/4 of all servings are driven by your frequent consumers versus your infrequent. And in terms of ratio, that their monthly frequency in terms of the number of occasions that they have is 4 times larger than your infrequent consumers. And of course, their drink rate as well, like how often they serve and drink themselves, is around 6 times that of infrequent consumers. So the point is that there is still a strategic play in terms of how do you appeal to these consumers? Who are they? What time of the day do they drink? What establishments do they go to? Is there something you can do to appeal to them in terms of the drinks they have? Would they try new products? Is there an innovation play? Extend your happy hours potentially? I think if you really focus in on these types of consumers, this is where you can maximize that opportunity, especially out on premise. But shifting towards, again, that 3/4 of those occasions where people are consuming and that habit that we've grown accustomed to over the last 3 years is around the home. And there is some interesting dynamics here, which we say is around the post-pandemic hometainment evolution. There's differences in if people are alone, and a lot of people are. It's usually skewed towards those that are older, but the needs are very different. They're looking at either being alone or being with their partners. Either they're watching TV, but the main point is they're de-stressing and they're relaxed. The dynamic, if you're still drinking at home, but somebody else's home, it's younger. They're looking to connect. They might not be going out because of pricing or whatever reasons, but these are large groups and they're looking to enjoy themselves as well. And they are also snacking during those occasions. So even on the in-home front, there's a very key strategic play that you need to dig into. What are the occasions that exist? How do you target them? And I'm just giving you two. There's a whole slew we can look into. And that has implications of a strategy, whether you're talking about your packaging, your pricing. Maybe you look at combining on specific types of snacks that appeal to these younger cohorts. There's lots of things at play that you can entertain. Trend number two, and one of the bigger ones, is that shifting generational dynamic. You know, the market shifts to the needs of what's available. And as younger cohorts get more entrenched into society, they have higher income levels, they're starting to nest and have families, they're going to have a bigger say in what the decisions are that corporations make. And that obviously applies to beverage alcohol. But there's a layer to it immediately as well. So younger cohorts are also more impacted by inflation. They're just more vulnerable. Their disposable incomes limited, they have less discretionary spending. So those are things you need to keep in mind as you're looking away from your core consumers to your younger ones. And again, from our global survey, we know that 82% of Gen Z say they are looking after their mental health, and compared to baby boomers, which is around 73%. So the pressures and more recent pressures are certainly affecting them. And here's the kind of downer moments. Like 1 in 5 Gen Z in the US are saying that they drink less alcohol per capita than millennials. Now let's have a look at the data and what that says when I look at consumption behavior. So this looks at all types of servings relative to category and cohort. And the two numbers I have is basically a cumulative of each of these bars. So you can see the first three accounts for 44% of all servings for beverage alcohol. I mean, first takeaway is that obviously it's all beer. We said it's the largest category. But what would be interesting to see is that millennials are actually really large. I mean, that's still part of your core group in terms of who's drinking, in addition to your boomers and Gen Xers as well. And if you look at the 80-20 ratio, which is really what this is, our kind of Pareto principle slide. 80% of your volume and your traffic and your servings are related to anyone that's millennial and above. And it's that 20% which is still related to Gen Z. They're much smaller. You can see there's differences in terms of preference, such as RTDs. But it's something where you need to ensure you figure out how you guard your core consumers as you consider opportunities in the future. And there are very big differences between each. So let's unpack that a little. So looking at various beverage consumption behaviors among these generations, we know that they're very different by cohort. First of all, the average number of beverage categories consumed is considerably higher the younger you are. Now, boomers pretty much have 2 beverages that they're overdeveloped in. One's obviously alcohol, and the other is coffee. If you think about all the shifts you've seen in terms of new categories that have come into the beverage space, years ago it was sports drinks and energy drinks, and recently it's more kombucha or cold brew coffee. This has all been driven by the younger generation. They've got at least 16 different varieties of beverages that they prefer or they're more developed in. So the point here is that you have to fight more for their share of stomach when it comes to beverages, because their repertoire of drinks are pretty vast. The good thing is they're open to trying new things. So how do you appeal to them? How do you educate them so they can try those things as well? Other quick kind of factoids in terms of servings. So the average monthly servings for total alcohol is higher among your boomers. So they do drink more in terms of overall servings. But that intensity number that I'd share, that's the one that's grown, is much higher among the younger cohort. So the occasions they drink a lot, and it's fairly large, even though the number of occasions they have per month, their frequency levels are smaller. And that ties back to the numbers that I've shown you in terms of the shifts. That's why your intensity levels are higher. It's these consumers. But the point is, how do you get their servings and their frequency up Maybe not to the level of boomers, but as they age up, that's kind of what you're targeting as well. I think some other findings that might be interesting is their actual alcohol preferences do vary, and some may surprise you. Now, this comes into the question around, well, is craft beer plateaued, or are dark spirits more preferred among young cohorts? Is that why cocktail culture is driving that? Well, if we look at beer preferences among youth, they actually like premium products. They prefer imports, and in fact, Mexican beer is quite skewed heavily among young cohorts as well. There's a couple of factors for that, which we'll dig into later as well, but certainly quality, the openness to try new things, a little bit of a brand loyalty. It's a bit of a spoiler alert, but it's less among these people. They want to try new things, and I think the insight around variety, trial, experiences tie into that as well. Spirit preferences, interestingly enough, the one that has skewed higher towards them is your darker one. So bourbon, whiskey has grown. Cocktail culture, I think course of the last year with Mad Men driving a lot of that, has really exploded. And those are the preferences that have driven among the youth when it comes to spirits. And another interesting factoid, we have a boosted sample of Hispanics, which really allows us to dig into that cohort in detail. Obviously, tequila is one thing they skew higher on, but the flavor Scotch is quite interesting. So don't forget that the average cohort among that community is generally young. And that ties into not just kind of their ethnicity, but also their preferences. It's related to their generation as well. Now, the attitudes towards alcohol continue to evolve. These are looking at general indexes in terms of attitudes for various statements we have for alcohol, looking at older and younger consumers. I think the first takeaway, as I was alluding to earlier, is that your older generations and boomers in particular stick to what they know, and it's expected. They like their brands, they know what they like, and they have the same sort of beverage at night. It becomes routine for them. Whereas your Gen Z in particular, you can see that they don't have a particular brand, so the brand loyalty factor is less. However, they do find unique labeling of importance. They do seek the advice of others because, again, they're trying to expand their knowledge and understand what they do. And certainly there's a social element where they want to factoid out that, I want to impress people in terms of what choices I make as well. That could be on terms like sustainability or something more sophisticated in terms of what the types of cocktails they choose. But digging into that a little bit further, if we looked at top ranked traits for alcohol choice, and in most cases, it's usually related to price, taste, or quality. But that's pretty even. There's not much differentiation at that kind of higher rank level. Where we see differences again around brand, again, underdeveloped among your Gen Z. And then we look at other things which are quite fascinating. They care about the occasion. They remember they have less occasions overall, so they're going to make it count. They care about the ingredients, where things are sourced from. Again, we'll talk about sustainability later on as well, and that could have a role there. And certainly recommendation, whether through word of mouth, through friends, or even retailers. Country of origin, less so. I think old and new wines, for example, might have a stronger resonance among older cohorts, but this is, again, things you can educate. I think it also reflects the influence of import beers for younger cohorts. And again, the packaging point as well. I think the main takeaway on this point is that the term influence really comes top of mind. You really have the ability to influence the behavior of these younger generations. I think you need to look at glass half full. It's not that they necessarily want to drink glass, there is that component, but how can you factor in what they will drink? How can you make it easier for them? Can you latch on to any type of proper social media campaign, or look at the right type of influencer that might give them the recommendation that might resonate with them? I think authenticity is pretty key, but those are various things that you can look into. Trend number 3, we in general are a lot more informed and educated than before. And it's not just talking about higher education. I think the advent of the internet is one of the biggest drivers, but if you look at infotainment in terms of documentaries that are available on streaming networks, And of course, I'm not going to get into generative AI, huge topic, and don't want to get into that rabbit hole, but I'm sure that's going to have a major factor here as well. All of these things have an impact on the choices people make. So from our global trend study, we know 86% of global consumers say they need to do more to look after themselves physically. 83% also said they would like to have more control over the decisions they make about their health. So all of this still ties back to consumption. They're going to have an impact on the choices they make, and it is having an impact on beverage alcohol. So looking in terms of those health factors, again, I think going through the trend and the differences by generation, we know that the worry about how alcohol will impact one's health is actually higher among your older cohorts. They're aging up. They are concerned about maybe the sugar content or the health factors of alcohol. Interestingly enough, younger cohorts, including your Gen Z, less so. What they do care about is they're paying attention to the nutritional content of what they're drinking. Oh, excuse me. Technical mishap. Just bear with me while I fix this. Okay, back to our regular scheduled show. So they do pay attention to the nutritional content. Okay, this is really testing me. And the nutritional information, I think this ties into, again, the knowledge. They're a lot more mindful of what they're putting into their stomachs, and this isn't limited to alcohol by any means. And I feel this is one of the biggest factors we've seen on the growth of adult non-alcoholic beverages. The alternatives that around non-alcoholic beer, wine, spirits, even cannabis-infused drinks, all skew towards younger cohorts. And it's kind of fascinating, even though it's relatively small, the growth rates have been seismic. So there is definitely an area of truth around this behavior change and the appeal these younger cohorts have for this. 47% of drinkers say that I'm careful about how much alcohol I drink. That's pretty high. Now, that's not necessarily that much different by cohort. 40% also say I'm drinking less alcohol than I used to. So that level of moderation certainly exists. I think our data validates that. The point here is that it doesn't necessarily have to be a doom and gloom scenario. I think you need to be mindful of it, but it's what's the strategic play here of how you can address it. You can obviously expand your products, but is it a way that you need to understand how to approach that market? In the same way with alcohol, even though it's beer and it's non-alcoholic beer, do you speak the same language? Because we know from our data that those occasions are different, the needs are different. Perhaps also the consumers could be too. So it's something to be mindful of. It's if you can't beat them, join them type of scenario. And then you have to be mindful of exactly how you approach it, because you don't want to take the same kind of approach you have as you have within your category. I think consumers are kind of demanding and asking corporations to be a lot more accountable than before when it comes to environment, social, and governance factors. And it's not just that you're going to have a lot of tokenism points that you want to state. It's like, what action are you taking here? And the actions corporations are providing will have a big impact on their marketplace credibility. It's just not the right thing to do. It actually has an impact on your bottom line, and this applies to beverage alcohol as well. We know our global consumers, close to half of them are willing to pay extra for a brand image that appeals to them. 65% prefer local brands made in a specific region or city to global brands. So there are things afoot on a global level that skews to that where are things sourced from, and people care about that. But I think the biggest aha, and one of the biggest numbers that we see is within alcohol drinkers, 63%, they're not just concerned, but they're actually active about sustainability and sustainable products. And the question here is, well, what are you doing to address these needs overall? So I'll share one example. It's a company called Epic Clean Tech. They recycle wastewater, particularly from a building in San Francisco, and they make delicious Kolsch beer out of it. Sounds like pie in the sky, or maybe I'm joking, but this was actually voted one of the best inventions by Time Magazine in 2022. And here's a company that is actually taking action. You know, they've got the innovation play, and they're looking at the products that are developed through it. Might not be appealing to everyone, but remember, they have all the quality controls in place to ensure that this is healthy. Otherwise, it wouldn't be in market. But these are just one examples of many that people are taking to address these needs, and really starting from the ground up to address what's in the market. And it certainly is going to pay dividends. If we look at our data, around 30% of drinkers saying they're willing to pay more for an alcohol brand that is ethical and sustainable. 26% are saying I'm interested in investing financially in companies that act in a sustainable manner. So there's enough out there, and of course this will differ depending on individuals, that state that I think this will make a difference for me. And as you can expect, it skews higher towards younger cohorts. So it's easier said than done, and especially if you have products out there. So I just wanted to leave behind, say, top 3 ESG, or environmental, social, and government behaviors that are reflected by alcohol drinkers that they consider important. And the 3 things are using recyclable materials and products and packaging, using sustainable or reusable energy, or using biodegradable products and packaging. So the point here is that even if you haven't started from the ground up with your products, you can still look into your processes to address them. And I think the main thing is that you have to make sure you do it. It's a small start, but you can't just do it for the sake of it. It has to be intrinsic value within your brand as well. Final trend, transforming of ingredients. I think the level of uncertainty that we see in the marketplace has really had consumers ask what's in what I'm drinking more so than ever. They want to understand what's the appeal beyond just sustenance, as well as the pleasure of drinking. And I think the whole point around holistic health, where it's more than just one thing, is driving a lot of that behavior change. And the ingredients, and not just where they're from, but the quality of it also has an impact. So we know that 73% of global consumers wish their life was more simple than before. And 80% of global consumers need to do more to look after their mental well-being. I think all of this ties back to your products as well and when you offer. But just taking a step back, you know, the term health and wellness, or at least the need when it comes to consumption, it's nebulous. You know, it means different things to different people. When we look at beverage consumption, 1/3 of all beverage consumption occasions are actually driven by the need for health and wellness. What's interesting is there's layers to it. Of course, the primary need around nutrient nourishment. This is where, you know, I care about my caloric intake. I care about the sugar quantity. That's by far the biggest, but it's going down. What we're seeing, what's growing, is around emotional well-being, and it's actually bigger than the physical benefits you're going to gain out of it. These are things related to mood lift. It's related to focus. It's related to positivity, or even energy as well. So these things, I think, when you think of health and wellness, it's just not in your traditional sense. Yeah, you can have a light beer and a diet beer, but there's other things I think you need to look into to expand. I think the whole functional beverage point and the trend we've seen there is something that's important. When we looked at the top ranked metabolic drivers for alcohol relative to all other beverages, what stood out was people were drinking because they wanted to improve the quality and quantity of their sleep, assisting with their pain management, and help manage symptoms of menopause. Now, this might be true, or maybe might not be ideal, but consumers do drink for various reasons, and there might be more than just the physical needs behind this. Again, that mood lift point is fairly important. And we've seen this across non-alcoholic beverages, where they are looking at the trends around adaptogens, the benefits they might have on your, not just your digestive systems, but again, your mood, your energy levels throughout the day. Those are healthier alternatives that might replace the needs you see here. So again, if you're looking at low no alcohol, are these traits that you need to ensure that you have to, again, separate yourself from what's out there. Another point, again, around ingredients is around the quality. And I think those points are important. So when we look at various label claims, when consumers are drinking alcohol, what stood out relative to all other beverages is they look at local, they notice premium, and light as well. And I think the premium point is where I want to latch on to, because it's obviously something that's unique to beverage alcohol. And it's also been growing overall. So when we look at high-end spirits, high-end beer servings, both have gone around 8% point share in the last 5 years and 5-point shares in the last 5 years as well. There's definitely an appeal and a need for this. I think the general sense is consumers are simplifying and they are looking for added benefits. And part of that looks at quality. And if they have those few occasions that they are drinking, that they want to have something that is of quality. And remember, when we looked at the top ranked points, quality was certainly one of them. So again, it's one of those areas that if you're looking for growth, looking where to target, drive revenue, certainly premiumization is still one thing that's important. So a lot of information. I wanted to kind of close with 5 kind of takeaways that I hope you can action, because that is really what we do and want to do with our data. The first point is around intentional socializing. So we've said that consumers are, they've been cocooning at home for a while, and those behaviors still are moving towards them. And of course, inflationary pressures are part of that. What can you do to make that journey easier? If they are entertaining at home, can you appeal to smaller households with smaller pack sizes? Again, the whole can innovation within wine is one of them as well. But if younger people are getting together, can you look at a combination of a large pack size, varieties, because that's what they like, or again, a kind of cross promotion with a type of snack that overall appeals to them as well. The shifting generational shifts, I think the needs among younger consumers being very different from older, their value, their mindset now makes you really rethink what the strategy and play will be. I think everything we spoke about really addresses a lot of that as well. But again, the point around influence, it's one that you're going to be able to address what their needs are, but what is the right channel for it? So you look at influencers on social media, you look at digital channels, and finding the right people that can recommend and educate these consumers will make you really have a leap ahead of your competitors overall as well. Obviously, the level of education and knowledge is having some level of impact of how mindful consumers are, and that is related to alcohol beverage. But again, if you are looking at expanding your offerings beyond beverage alcohol, what is the right play there? How do you approach it? What are the right occasions that you need to target, and what are the needs? So there's a whole different strategy and a clear understanding that you need should you venture into that area as well. And the area around authenticity and where you want to trace your environmental, social, and government causes. I think the main thing is you have to be walking the talk. I think consumers, especially your younger consumers, are going to be able to see through things that look at tokenism. It's not enough that you're planting 100 trees for every product that's purchased. That's table stakes. What you need to do is ensure that everything you do is kind of ingrained into your brand. And it's easier said than done, but it can be steady steps towards it as well. And then finally, the points around transforming ingredients. I think if you can add additional benefits and you can have a direct relation to how this might uplift people's moods, make sure that's vocalized. Make sure you shout through the rooftops, and this is what my product can offer. Otherwise, people's awareness levels and knowledge is just not going to be there. So a lot of information we've shared with you. We're really giving you a drop in the ocean of the level of detail we get into. Again, it's a decade's worth of information with a lot of depth, and the expertise we have really allows us to not just look back, but really plan for the future. And what we would love to do is start helping you understand and dissect these trends, dig into them even further. And really, I think it's really important as you move forward, if you see the level of disruption there is in the industry, this is the time to really understand the direction the markets are going to change and what are the triggers and signals directing that. So with that, I will see if there's any questions. Just having a quick time check. I think we have some time. So there is one, a fairly popular one I've seen over the years is this presentation available to us? So the polite answer and quick answer is no. However, we will be releasing a POV next week, which is an accompaniment to this. It's going to be in the public space, so we'll share that with you. But more importantly, reach out to us. You have our contact details here. Would love to talk to you, better understand what your needs are and how we can help. Another question is, are there any other trends beyond the 5 that we've looked at? There are actually quite a bit. One other that's top of mind that I didn't have, again, the time for today's webinar to go through is around the impact of tech, obviously. This has a point around education, information, and social media channels, but at the same token, what we've seen is digital delivery and the ability to communicate directly with your guests has been growing. It's a strong appeal for alcohol. Beverage incidents and delivery channels are usually lower. So these are just some areas that I think can be big opportunities down the road as they grow. And that channel has certainly grown since the start of the pandemic. It has petered out a little bit, but still an opportunity out there. So with that, I'll end. Again, thank you for your time. I hope you have a great rest of your afternoon. Ellen, back to you.
Thank you, Asad. Thank you for today's amazingly great presentation. I feel like it's so timely before the long weekend. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I know there's some questions we did not get to, but we will do so by email. We welcome the opportunity to speak with you, so please reach out to us directly. That now concludes today's webinar. Have a wonderful day, everyone.